Great. Thanks, Cam, and hello, everyone. I am happy to be talking to you today. I looked at the attendee list, and I see a lot of folks around Kansas who are participating that we've worked with in the past through different Kansas work that Natasha and I have been involved in. So I just want to kind of say hello to everyone, and thanks for joining us. I know that there were a few people that had wanted to participate in today's webinar, and they had a conflicting meeting, but they're going to be watching the recording or listening to the recording. So thanks for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. I know that over the past few years, the Public Health Law Center has worked with a number of you around Kansas on your walking and bicycling and active transportation initiatives. And I feel like through our work together, we've really honed in on some areas where local communities in Kansas are focusing and I think really starting to understand where some of the opportunities and challenges are in moving some of this active transportation and active living work forward. And a couple of the areas that have come up a fair amount in the work over the years has been about like sidewalks in local communities and railroad crossings. So that's what we're going to be covering today. And I did just want to acknowledge also that our webinar today is being funded through some work that we're doing with KDHE. And so I know that we work with a number of Kansas partners around the state, but KDHE is who is sponsoring the webinar today. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Maro, and I'm a senior staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center. I focus on healthy eating and active living initiatives and really working with laws and policies to support efforts to promote health through better eating and physical activity in local communities at the state level, and there are some federal issues that come up as well. I've been working in Kansas for, I want to say almost 4 years now, and have spent a fair amount of time in your lovely state, and feel like I have had an opportunity to really see on the ground some of the opportunities and challenges that you're facing in local Kansas communities to improve opportunities for active transportation specifically in your communities. Before I get started, in case there's anyone on the webinar that isn't familiar with the Public Health Law Center, I wanted to just give you a little bit of information about us. We are a nonprofit organization affiliated with the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we work on a number of different legal issues impacting some of the most pressing chronic public health issues facing our country today, primarily in tobacco control and tobacco usage, eating healthy and access to healthy foods, and physical activity. And if you think about the challenges that we have as a country and some of the chronic health issues that we're trying to grapple with, if we could address those three areas, tobacco control, healthy eating, and physical activity, we would be probably like 90% of the way to a healthier nation and healthier communities. And there's a lot of ways that laws and policies can help impact and support those efforts at the local, state, and federal level. So we work with those of you out in communities and other public health partners and advocates to help move these initiatives forward. The Public Health Law Center provides legal technical assistance, and what that generally means is that we do a lot of research and writing in response to specific questions that people may have that come up in their communities, wanting to understand how laws and policies impact the work that they're doing, trying to anticipate where some problems may come up, and trying to, in anticipating them, hopefully avoiding any challenges that may come up related to laws and policies. And then we do trainings, webinars, present at conferences, and develop a number of resources. And I just wanted to note that today's webinar really is coming out of the work that we've been doing with you in Kansas and responding to questions and themes and challenges that you have in creating a healthier community through walking and bicycling. So today's webinar is going to really focus in on two key areas that impact safety and accessibility for pedestrians and bicyclists, and that includes sidewalks and railroad crossings. And there's a number of different legal and policy considerations that impact at the local level what happens with both of these types of facilities that are used heavily by pedestrians and bicyclists, and that can also either support more active lifestyles or detract from the ability of community members to be more physically active. So I think that we've got some new content and some new information to share with you, and hopefully we can, if you have any questions or comments along the way, we invite you to put those questions in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, in the question and answer tab, and we'll take those at the end of the webinar. So I'm excited to introduce to you Carrie Mies. She's a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and some of you may have encountered Carrie over the past 2 or 3 years. She's been a research assistant and law clerk at the Public Health Law Center, and recently came on board. She graduated from law school a year ago and is now a staff attorney with us. And Carrie has specialized in complete streets and active transportation issues over the past 3 years with a really big focus on what's happening in Kansas. And so I just want to just acknowledge all of the work behind the scenes that Carrie has been doing over the past 3 years, and introduce her to you because she has been behind the scenes but doing a lot of work that hopefully you all have been benefiting from. So one of the things that just in introducing Carrie to you that I thought you might enjoy knowing is that Carrie is a dog enthusiast, and she has 2 German Shepherds, Leah and Kenobi, indicating her Star Wars enthusiasm. And with her German Shepherd, she is certified in canine live scent trailing as part of search and rescue operations. So it's really fun to hear about Carrie's other life with her dogs and her service to the community, in addition to her work here at the Public Health Law Center. So it's fun to have Carrie on board and to hear from her in her new position here at the Public Health Law Center. So in getting started, I wanted to just kind of, again, create a little context for the webinar today. So sidewalks are like a really important part of having safe places for pedestrians to walk and where bicyclists can also bike. But there's a lot of questions that come up about how do you pay for sidewalks, who's responsible if somebody gets hurt, and what are the policy and legal levers that are available to make sidewalks more accessible in local communities. And again, as so many things, it's not a one-size-fits-all at all in Kansas as far as what a sidewalk should look like, how they should be implemented in local communities. But there are some tools that you can use that the Kansas law and some different policies can support your efforts in a meaningful way. And generally, Kansas law places responsibility for sidewalks on both local governments and the owner of any property that's adjacent to a sidewalk. Cities generally have the most complete authority over sidewalks within their boundaries, and understanding these responsibilities ensures that sidewalks in Kansas are constructed, maintained, and operated in a way that supports opportunities to be physically active and improve health. And another thing I just want to note is there's public sidewalks and private sidewalks. Our conversation today is really going to be focused on public sidewalks and the legal parameters impacting both local governments in Kansas and property owners in public sidewalks in local communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie.
All right, thank you, Mary, for the introduction, as well as leading us into the sidewalk issues in Kansas. And I would like to thank everybody that's participating today. I'm really excited to be talking with you about these issues. The obligations that local governments and property owners may have regarding sidewalks that I'm going to talk in detail about generally involve design standards, construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and repair, paying for sidewalks, as well as liability for injuries that occur on sidewalks. So I'm going to start by briefly before we go into the details of what responsibilities local governments and property owners have regarding sidewalks, we have to define what a sidewalk is. Under Kansas law, a sidewalk is defined as the portion of a street between the curb or lateral lines of a roadway and the neighboring property lines intended for use by pedestrians. And again, just highlighting that the focus of this webinar will be on sidewalks that are open for public use and not sidewalks that are on private property. And it's also important to distinguish what a property owner is. A property owner in this context means the owner of any property that is adjacent to a public sidewalk. So I'm going to start by briefly discussing design standards as they relate to public sidewalks in Kansas. Both property owners and local governments are responsible for ensuring public sidewalks meet required design specifications when constructing, maintaining, or repairing the sidewalk. For example, design specifications may include requirements for how wide a public sidewalk must be or whether a barrier curb separating pedestrians from traffic must be constructed. And since we're talking about public sidewalks, the Americans with Disabilities Act applies. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law that prohibits the discrimination of individuals with disabilities in all public programs, services, and facilities. An example of an ADA design specification may be a requirement that a sidewalk include a curb cut so it is accessible to people using wheelchairs. The U.S. Access Board is the federal agency charged with developing and maintaining ADA design criteria. This is a very technical and complicated area of law, so we will not be going into the details here. However, if you have any questions, additional information on ADA standards and tips on how local governments can comply with the ADA can be found on the U.S. Access Board website. So when it comes to the construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and repair of public sidewalks, local governments may establish ordinances creating requirements for sidewalks, and these can be established through subdivision regulations, zoning ordinances, or a city resolution. Cities may also construct a sidewalk or make any necessary repairs to sidewalks at any time, but they are not required to do so. And additionally, local governments may condemn a sidewalk and order the property owner to construct or repair it. They must do this through a resolution that declares the sidewalk inadequate or unsafe, and they must give property owners 30 to 60 days to construct or reconstruct the condemned sidewalk. If the property owner fails to construct or reconstruct a condemned sidewalk, then the city is responsible for constructing it, and they may charge the property owners for the cost through a special assessment. On the other hand, owners of property abutting a public sidewalk may construct or repair public sidewalks at any time at their own expense. If they choose to do this, they must meet the same sidewalk plans and specifications the city would have to meet if the city were the one constructing the sidewalk. Property owners may file a request or petition the city to construct or repair a sidewalk on their behalf. If property owners petition the city, there has to be a required minimum number of property owners on the petition. 10 property owners are required in cities of the second or third class, and in cities of the first class, 25 property owners are required to sign the petition. Additionally, property owners may be responsible for all maintenance and repair of public sidewalks. So when communities are thinking about sidewalks, a big issue that comes up is how to pay for these and who is responsible for paying for the sidewalks. There are a wide range of tools used by local governments to pay for public sidewalks, and there are a number of legal considerations that may come up depending on how local governments choose to pay for the public sidewalks. Several Kansas communities are working towards implementing policies that aim to construct public sidewalks as well as provide incentives to encourage residents to repair existing public sidewalks. These policies include establishing transportation user fees and cost-sharing programs. However, these policy initiatives are not without their own challenges. Local governments may not actually have the authority to implement transportation user fees, and liability concerns arise when local governments help fund public sidewalks. Under Kansas law, The city may finance the construction or repair of a public sidewalk from funds that are set aside for maintaining streets or the city's general fund. The city is also responsible for funding public sidewalks adjacent to property that is owned by the city. Local governments may also be responsible for paying for sidewalks that are adjacent to property owned by the state of Kansas or the United States. On the other hand, property owners are often responsible for paying for some of the costs of any construction or repair to public sidewalks that are adjacent to properties that they own. However, as we will discuss in a minute, many local governments have created cost-sharing programs to help defray some of the costs of public sidewalk construction and maintenance and to support the development of this infrastructure in local communities. Additionally, when a city has to pay for a public sidewalk, like in the case of a property owner failing to repair a condemned sidewalk, the city may levy a special assessment against the property owner to reimburse the city for the cost. There are a number of different types of funding mechanisms that local governments use. Some, but not all of these mechanisms can be used to pay for public sidewalks. It's helpful to understand the differences between these different funding mechanisms to assess which ones may best meet the needs of your community and which ones can be used to pay for sidewalks. Kansas courts have determined that local governments are allowed to use property taxes, fees, and special assessments to pay for public sidewalks. However, as I will discuss later, local governments are not allowed to use excise taxes to pay for public sidewalks. And it's important to note also that the name a local government uses for the funding mechanism to pay for local sidewalks is not as important as how the funding mechanism is structured. Therefore, although a city may establish a transportation user fee, the way the fee is structured may actually make it an excise tax, even though it is still called a fee. It's important to understand the differences so that you don't run into problems when setting up these programs. The Kansas Court of Appeals has recently distinguished a tax from a fee and a special assessment, as well as discussed what constitutes an excise tax. The key takeaways from these definitions are that a tax is involuntary, it is assessed against the general population, and it is for a governmental service that benefits everybody. A fee, on the other hand, is voluntary. It's only assessed against those enjoying an exclusive benefit, and that benefit is only enjoyed by the people who are charged. A special assessment, on the other hand, is imposed on specific properties for payment of a specific local improvement. So the Kansas Court of Appeals recently reviewed a transportation user fee that was established by the City of Mission, Kansas. The City of Mission created a transportation user fee and charged all property owners within the city. The amount that property owners had to pay was based on a formula that attempted to estimate the number of vehicle trips a particular property generated. And the funds from the transportation user fee were then used for the maintenance and upkeep of the city's streets, bicycle lanes, and sidewalks. The transportation user fee was challenged by Heartland Apartment Association, Building Owners and Managers Association, and several individual property owners. And the court ruled that it was an impermissible excise tax that violated the city's home rule authority. So a little bit of context on that. Cities in Kansas, under the constitutional home rule, have broad authority of self-government, including the authority to levy taxes and fees. However, this authority may be limited by the Kansas legislature, which passed a law generally prohibiting cities and counties from imposing an excise tax. And it is also worth noting here that an excise tax is different from a retail sales tax. The reasoning that the court decided the TUF was an impermissible excise tax was because property owners were required to pay it and they could not opt out. Therefore, it was an involuntary funding mechanism. The property owners were required to pay for something, in this case sidewalks, bicycle lanes that benefited everyone, even though only property owners had to pay for it. So the important takeaway from this case is that local governments have to be careful about how they structure any taxes or fees for sidewalk construction and maintenance to make sure that it doesn't fall into a category of an impermissible excise tax on property owners. Even though the court found that the type of transportation fee that Mission, Kansas established was not allowed, there are a number of ways that local governments can support and fund the development of public sidewalks in local Kansas communities. Many local governments in Kansas have found that cost-sharing programs are an effective way to encourage the development of public sidewalks and work with property owners to create more walkable communities by providing public sidewalks. While property owners may be reluctant to or resist paying for sidewalks, research has shown that having sidewalks can increase property value and can make neighborhoods more desirable. And by providing a cost-sharing program, property owners are often more receptive to paying for public sidewalks as they don't have to shoulder the entire cost, and they stand to benefit from increased property value that comes from having a safe, walkable neighborhood. Cost-sharing programs are different from transportation user fees in that they are voluntary, and the funds don't pay for a general governmental service that benefits everyone. Instead, the funds are used for specific sidewalk projects, and only the owners of property adjacent to the sidewalk are paying for the work that is being done. There are a lot of different ways that Kansas cities can use cost-sharing programs to support the development of public sidewalks. These programs can be used to develop new sidewalks in addition to providing funds for the maintenance or reconstruction of existing sidewalks. Funding for cost-sharing programs can come from a wide range of sources. There may be state or federal funds available that the city can use, and also a city could designate a certain part of its general fund for sidewalk purposes. Another key concern and issue that comes up with local sidewalks is what happens if somebody gets hurt. Who is responsible, and who is liable for injuries that occur on sidewalks? Before we answer this question, we need to briefly discuss what liability is. Liability means holding someone legally responsible for an injury that their action or inaction has caused. Typically, for a person to be held liable for someone else's injuries, an injured person must prove 4 things. The accused person had a legal responsibility to protect the injured person from harm. This is also known as the duty of care. The accused person failed to protect the injured person, or they breached their duty of care. And as a result of the accused person's failure to protect them, the injured person was actually injured and suffered damages. The general expectation is that a person will act reasonably towards others, but what is considered reasonable depends on each individual circumstance. So how do you know what is considered reasonable? In general, we have an obligation as individuals and entities not to do things that put others in harm's way. Negligence is the failure to act as carefully as an ordinary, reasonable person would in the same situation. On the other hand, if an individual intentionally puts another in harm's way, they will be held to a higher standard of legal responsibility for any injury that occurs. In order to put this into some context and further clarify with real-world examples, Kansas courts have discussed this issue relating to sidewalks. In Harris versus McConnell, a case from 1965, a property owner was a lumber company that constructed a sidewalk in front of their business. A customer leaving the business stepped into a hole and fell, sustaining injuries. The customer then brought an action against the property owner, claiming that the sidewalk surface was uneven and it was constructed on the wrong grade. The court found in this case that the property owner could be held liable because the property owner had actually constructed the sidewalk in a defective manner. On the other hand, Taggart versus Kansas City, a case from 1943, held the opposite. An individual was walking along a residential sidewalk when she fell and was injured. The sidewalk was made of concrete slabs and a tree had grown in the parking area along the sidewalk. A root of the tree had grown under the sidewalk, which raised one of the slabs above the others, creating an uneven surface, much like the picture that is shown here. The court in this case decided that the city was not liable for the individual's injuries because the city is not required to furnish perfect sidewalks. Instead, they must provide sidewalks that are reasonably safe for use. The court in this case believed that the sidewalk was reasonably safe for use because it had been in the same condition for 6 to 8 years and no one had previously fallen or had any difficulty using the sidewalk safely. So going back to the question of who is liable for these injuries. Generally, property owners are only liable for an injury caused by a defect in a sidewalk if the defect was caused by the property owner. Local governments, on the other hand, could be held to a slightly higher standard than property owners. Local governments could be liable for defects in the sidewalk if the defect is considerable, the government had notice of the defect, and the government failed to repair the sidewalk. Additionally, local governments could be liable for a defect if they created the defect, which is the same as property owners. So a question that usually comes up in this situation is whether or not governmental immunity applies to local governments for injuries involving public sidewalks. Whether or not governmental immunity applies varies by state law. In general, governmental immunity protects the government and its employees from liability while they're acting within the course of their employment. And in some states, such as Minnesota, governmental immunity applies to injuries resulting from public sidewalks. However, the Kansas Supreme Court has ruled that governmental immunity does not apply to injuries resulting from defects in streets or sidewalks. The reasoning behind this is that public streets and sidewalks are necessary for public use at all times and under all conditions. Therefore, the city has a legal responsibility to keep its sidewalks in a condition that is reasonably safe for use. As I stated previously, a city is not required to furnish perfect sidewalks and is not an insurer of the safety of individuals who use its streets and sidewalks. The slight defect rule places a limitation on city liability for injuries caused by defects in a sidewalk. A sidewalk defect must be of such magnitude that it is likely to cause an injury to travelers proceeding with reasonable care. And the city is not responsible for an injury when the sidewalk becomes defective through use, age, or similar means. And this includes a sidewalk becoming defective because of weather conditions such as snow and ice. The city must also have notice of the defective condition of the sidewalk for a time sufficient enough to make repairs. Additionally, again, if the city is the cause of the defect, the slight defect rule will not apply and the city could be held liable. Property owners, on the other hand, have a legal responsibility to keep sidewalks adjacent to their property in good condition. However, this responsibility is owed to the city and not to individuals using the sidewalk. Therefore, property owners will only be held liable for injuries if the property owner constructs or maintains the sidewalk in a defective manner. So how does liability impact cost-sharing programs? It likely does not have much of an impact. As it stands, property owners are responsible for funding sidewalks, and this responsibility does not create liability on the landowner for injuries sustained by sidewalk defects unless the landowner is responsible for creating the defect. The city is only liable for injuries if the defect in the sidewalk is considerable and the city had notice or the city itself created the defect. So if the city, instead of the property owner, funded the construction, maintenance, or repair of a sidewalk, liability for injuries sustained by a defect in the sidewalk would likely not change.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. It's kind of interesting since in the time that the Public Health Law Center has been working in Kansas, this case that Carrie mentioned about the transportation user fee has come up and has shifted some of the conversation and considerations that local communities might have around sidewalk construction and payment of sidewalks. So it's always good kind of check back in with the law because things do change from time to time. Now we're going to shift some from sidewalks to railroad crossings because as I've come to really appreciate in my time in Kansas, that Kansas is a railroad country. And I've seen firsthand some of the challenges that can be faced in local communities trying to create more walkable and bikeable communities, and running into some of the challenges that come up with railroad crossings that, you know, bifurcate a community or that may be near a school or other area where pedestrians and bicyclists frequent. And one of the things with railroad crossings is that there is, I think, a lot of confusion about who is responsible for what with railroad crossings, both from the safety and liability perspective and the payment for crossings and the design of those crossings. And oftentimes, I think the primary focus of railroad crossing projects can be on railroad and highway crossings, but pedestrians and bicyclists often have to cross railroads in other settings, and they do encounter many safety issues. So there are a lot of types of railroad crossings that impact pedestrians and bicyclists. These can include general road crossings without any designated pedestrian or bicycle path or route. Railroad crossings can also impact recreational trails only used by bicyclists and pedestrians. And also, railroad crossings impact sidewalks, bike lanes, and other types of facilities primarily used by pedestrians and bicyclists. And one of the things, too, I think, the surface of the railroad crossing can impact bicyclists and pedestrians in a different way than it impacts motorized vehicles. And so all of those things come into play when we're thinking about railroad crossings and how to move forward when you have, when you're moving outside of some parts of the community that are not under the local government's authority, and how to work with and partner with railroad companies to address some of the concerns in communities. So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to talk us through some of the issues with railroad crossings.
So similar to sidewalks, both local governments as well as railroad companies in Kansas have obligations relating to railroad crossings, and these generally involve design standards, the type of railroad crossing, paying for railroad crossings, pedestrian, bicycle safety issues, as well as liability for injuries that occur at railroad crossings. As I did with the sidewalk discussion, I'm going to go over each of these in greater detail. So one of the major problems with railroad crossings is the lack of uniform standards. There's no official federal design standards that are specific to railroad crossings. Existing standards and regulations that do include some railroad crossing standards only focus on railroad highway crossings and generally do not address sidewalks or recreational trails. So the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways by the Federal Highway Administration contains some design requirements for railroad highway crossings. And these standards provide requirements for railroad crossings of federal highways. And for an example of a design standard is that all signs used at railroad crossings must be reflective or illuminated during both the day and the night. The Railroad Highway Grade Crossing Handbook was additionally developed by the Federal Highway Administration to provide a single reference document on best practices related to railroad highway grade crossings. However, this handbook does not constitute official standards, specifications, or regulations. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials created a guide for the development of bicycle facilities that includes a section on intersections and rail crossings. As with the Railroad Highway Grade Crossing Handbook, the AASHTO guide is also unofficial. And additionally, railroad companies such as Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe BSNF Railroad also usually have their own guidelines for railroad projects. So, as with sidewalk design standards, railroad crossing design is very technical and complicated, so I will not be discussing it in detail here, but it is important to note that the lack of uniformity in standards and regulations and the many different official and unofficial resources makes railroad crossings even more confusing. More information on these resources and railroad design standards, if you're interested, can be found on the U.S. Federal Highway Administration website. So in thinking about railroad crossings, it's important that we're all on the same page as to what a railroad crossing actually is. There are different kinds of railroad crossings that may have different types of safety considerations impacting bicycles and pedestrians. In addition, different design standards may apply depending on what type of railroad crossing is addressed. The most common type of railroad crossing is an at-grade separation, where an intersection of two or more transportation surfaces cross at the same height. An example of this is the first picture on the left in the slide. The Union Pacific and BSNF railroad guidelines, again, which are unofficial, state that the railroad does not allow at-grade trail crossings. In this situation, they are generally referring to recreational trails. However, it's unclear if this applies to sidewalks. And these guidelines additionally do not apply to other railroads, which may have their own design guidelines. The Manual on Uniform Traffic Controlled Devices additionally encourages the elimination of at-grade railroad crossings. However, at-grade crossings immediately adjacent to an existing public roadway crossing with warning devices may be considered. So this is something to keep in mind when trying to establish a new crossing. You might want to use a section of a trail or a sidewalk that is along a street that is also in need of a crossing. This is going to give the project a higher priority, which you will see becomes important in the next few slides. The other type of rail crossing is shown in the picture on the right. It is a grade separation crossing, which is an overhead or underpass structure that crosses the railroad tracks, such as a pedestrian bridge. This type of crossing is safer than an at-grade separation. However, these types of crossings are also much more expensive to construct and maintain. So the pictures in this slide are actually before and after pictures of a project that was done in Olaf, Kansas. This project is a good example of how one community has addressed railroad crossings and safety issues that impact pedestrians and bicycles. Before the project, downtown Olaf had 11 at-grade rail crossings in their downtown area that caused traffic delays and noise from train whistles at all hours of the day and night. The city decided to establish a quiet zone to help eliminate those noise problems. The Olaf Quiet Zone project created a grade separation that elevated the tracks for 1.4 miles through the town, eliminating 4 at-grade crossings. And the project also created safety modifications on all at-grade crossings, which allowed trains to pass through without a Federal Railroad Administration requirement to blow their train horns. So another major problem with establishing safe railroad crossings is how to obtain funding for the construction and installation of warning devices. Both the local government, usually the county, and railroad companies are responsible for paying the cost of railroad crossings. However, many programs, as those listed here, have been established that allow state and federal funds to be used for railroad crossing projects. The Kansas State Railroad Crossing Inventory and Hazard Index was established by the Kansas Department of Transportation. It is a state rail crossing inventory and formula that prioritizes all at-grade rail crossings in Kansas. The hazard index is used to rate the relative hazard potential for all crossings based on highway traffic, train traffic, and any warning devices that are in place. It's worth noting here that this index does not specifically discuss pedestrian and bicycle safety issues. And each year, a number of the highest ranked crossings, which means the most hazardous crossings, are selected and projects are implemented to improve those crossings. Federal aid is available and may be used to finance up to 100% of the cost of these projects. The second funding option is the Railroad Grade Separation Program. This program was established to replace state highway railroad at grade crossings with grade separation structures. The hazard index is also used to prioritize these projects, and these projects are financed by a combination of federal, state, railroad, and local government funds. The third program is the Kansas Local Partnership Railroad Grade Separation Program. This program addresses highway railroad at grade crossings that are not on the state highway system. Therefore, they have a lower priority and a lesser chance of being chosen for project funding. Through this program, local governments solicit a rail crossing project, and a project sponsor is responsible for providing 10 to 20% of the project funds. The project sponsor is also responsible for negotiating with the railroad. Any funding that the railroad provides is counted towards the 10 to 20% of local funds. And again, projects are selected through the hazard index. However, consideration is also given to projects with higher rates of local railroad funding to leverage state dollars and the overall positive effects the project may have on the community. Finally, the Kansas state-funded Highway Railroad Crossing Program provides $300,000 per year of state funds for projects that do not meet the requirements for funding under any of the previous programs. These projects are funded with 80% state funds and 20% railroad company funds. Local jurisdictions must submit crossings for funding, and projects are chosen on a case-by-case basis. So the problem that pedestrians and bicyclists have regarding railroad crossings is that the primary concerns of railroad companies are on safety and liability. But isn't this a good thing? Well, this focus on safety and liability makes railroad companies extremely hesitant to allow trails along active rail lines and generally oppose the installation of new crossings. Additional issues that are specific to recreational trails and sidewalks is again the lack of official uniform standards that are specific to railroad crossings and specifically address crossings as they relate to sidewalks and recreational trails. Many trail users, especially bicyclists, have a low tolerance for delays at crossings, and children may also not be aware of any traffic rules, which creates additional problems and safety concerns. And this lack of guidance, coupled with the nature of recreational trail use, has made it difficult to ensure safe rail crossings on trails. So if a railroad company is not willing or a local government is not able to establish a new railroad crossing, what can be done to make crossings safer for pedestrians and bicyclists? Public rail crossings are required to have passive warning signs, which are usually installed by local or state agencies. These types of warning signs include pavement markings, stop and yield signs, as well as crossbucks, which is in the bottom picture of this slide. And upgrading from a passive warning sign to an active sign, which includes a gate and flashing lights, is a determination that's made by the Kansas Department of Transportation, again through their hazard index. If the crossing is selected for an upgrade, the state enters into an agreement with the railroad company to install the active warning device. Private rail crossings, it should be noted, are found on roads that are not maintained by a public authority, and they are not required to have any warning signs. So in addition to warning signs on the railroad crossing itself, these signs can be placed on sidewalks or recreational trails as well. Pavement markings are the most common type of warning sign on recreational trails. Usually these include different coloring or texturing, such as rumble strips or speed bumps that alert bicyclists to a crossing. As stated previously, a key concern of railroad companies is liability for injuries that may occur at railroad crossings. So this raises the question, does that mean that the railroad company bears the liability? Liability for injuries that occur on railroad crossings are determined on a case-by-case basis under the standards of negligence. The Waits versus St. Louis San Francisco Rail Yard Company case establishes this rule. And generally, the Kansas courts have decided that a railroad company may be liable for injuries that occur at a railroad crossing if the railroad company was negligent in the construction of the crossing, the installation of warning devices, or the operation of its trains. However, if the injured person failed to act reasonably, they could also be held contributorily negligent and might not be able to recover any damages from the railroad company. So it's helpful to think about how some of these issues have played out in the real world. There are some actual cases that have come up in Kansas where railroad crossing safety and liability issues have been litigated. I'm going to discuss some of those cases here to help illustrate how some of the legal concepts play out. And a key consideration in determining liability often rests on what action is reasonable under a specific situation. In Williams versus Iowa Electric Railroad Company, a case from 1918, a driver failed to stop his car at the railroad crossing to determine whether it was safe to cross. Nothing had prevented the driver from seeing an approaching train. However, he still didn't stop to look and was not able to stop in time to avoid a collision with the rail train. Because of his failure to stop and see if it was safe to cross, the court determined that the driver did not act reasonably in crossing the railroad and was therefore contributorily negligent, and the railroad company was not liable for his injuries. On the other hand, Lane versus Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company, a case from 1940, the railroad company operated in an intersection where a highway crossed a series of 10 different tracks. The railroad company had a bell and signal light system to warn and control traffic at the crossing. A pedestrian that was walking on the sidewalk stopped when the bells rang and the light system was lighted and waited for the train to cross. After the train had passed, the bell and light system stopped and the pedestrian believed that it was safe and proceeded to cross the track. About halfway across, a switch engine backed into the pedestrian and injured him. The court in this case determined that the pedestrian had acted reasonably when crossing the railroad tracks, and the railroad company may be liable for the negligent operation of its warning system. So it has been established that railroad companies, local governments, pedestrians, and bicyclists are all concerned with the same thing, which is safety. So how can these entities work together to ensure safe railroad crossings are provided to serve the needs of everyone? The Kansas Department of Transportation, some local governments, and railroad companies have entered into agreements with each other to improve the safety of railroad crossings. These agreements could provide a framework for how other local governments can partner with railroad companies to provide railroad crossings that best ensure the safety of their community. A way that railroad companies, local governments, and state governments can enter into agreements is the use of different types of agreements and contracts. For example, in 2002, the Kansas Department of Transportation entered into an agreement with BNSF Railway Company to improve safety at railroad crossings by removing vegetation at crosswalks that interferes with sight lines. The parties agreed to share the cost of the vegetation removal. The agreement also shows that Kansas Department of Transportation and railroad companies understand that visibility is an important concern at railroad crossings, and although appropriate warnings are needed at crosswalks, it's also essential to implement measures that promote visibility at crossings. And another agreement was between the City of Manhattan, Union Pacific Railroad Company, and the Kansas Secretary of Transportation. These parties entered into an agreement in 2007 to upgrade warning signals at a railroad crossing in the City of Manhattan. The agreement stipulates that the Secretary of Transportation would apply for federal aid to pay the entire cost of the project, and the agreement required the railroad company to remove the existing crossbucks, furnish the materials for the project, and install the new active warning device. So these examples illustrate that there are opportunities to address safety issues impacting bicyclists and pedestrians at railroad crossings, but that these types of efforts generally need to involve multiple parties, including local government, state government entities, and railroad companies.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. And before we get to questions, I wanted to just go over a couple of resources that we have. The Public Health Law Center has and continues to work with Kansas communities on a number of different issues impacting active transportation and the safety of pedestrians and bicyclists. And questions, as I mentioned earlier, questions about sidewalks and railroad crossings are amongst the most frequent issues that come up. And we have developed some resources on sidewalk and rail-to-trail initiatives indicated in this slide. And we are also, though, continuing to have more discussions with communities around challenges and opportunities to address safety concerns of bicyclists and pedestrians from railroad crossings in local communities. This is a new area that we are developing, and we would actually just love to hear from any of you working in this area or those that may have questions or challenges that you're trying to navigate as we try to move forward and think about how we can support you and work together to help make your communities safer, recognizing the central place that railroads have in Kansas. We also have a number of resources more generally available about the complete streets and active transportation, and it's available on our Kansas Bicycling and Walking resource page. We continue to develop resources and update these resources from time to time, and so I just want to remind you that this is available to you. And as part of our continued work in Kansas, we are collecting and analyzing local complete streets policies across Kansas. And so I just wanted to invite any of you who are working in this area to please let us know of any complete streets policies that you may have in your community or know of so that we can make sure to include that in our review. So before we sign off, I think we've got just a few minutes, and we have a couple of questions here that I wanted to discuss. And so the first one, let me get back to it. Oh, in the Q&A. Great. So there was a question asked if there are any standards being developed for railroad crossings by entities such as ASTM International that can eliminate some of the inconsistencies that Carrie mentioned earlier. And basically, it seems like this person mentioned that there's not regulation by which all entities must adhere, and this starts to get to some of the root cause of some of the issues that we're seeing nationally right now, such as some of the big oil operating without some accountability or oversight, like some of the pipeline work that's going on, and railroads are really kind of a key player in this conversation as far as railroads going, carrying a lot of oil or hazardous materials through communities, railroad crossings, and really some significant safety issues that impact rural and rural communities, not just in Kansas, but around the country. And I guess my response to that is that I don't know of any specific standards right now that are being developed for railroad crossings, but I think that this is actually a really important issue because the lack of uniformity and is a challenge for folks. And I also feel like, especially with some of the oil delivery and some of the natural resource I can think of situations with coal and oil and some other, kind of heavy industry usage of railroads that impacts safety in local communities in a way that I do think that having more standardized design standards and guidelines for what railroads carry as far as hazardous materials and how it impacts local communities would be really important. Any kind of development of a standard like that, though, would be, I think, fairly involved because it wouldn't be something that at the local level. I think that it would involve state departments of transportation and likely the federal Department of Transportation, especially to the extent that any of these rails cross state lines. one state wouldn't be able to establish a standard without, one state wouldn't be able to establish a standard that impacted rail activities in other states. So I think that there's some interstate commerce clause issues that that could come into play that could be interesting, but I think that that's a really good point. Carrie, I don't know if you have anything else in that?
I would just say that that's a really interesting thing to think about, and I think there is definitely a need for some overall standards, because what we do see is the railroad companies trying to compensate for it, and they're creating their own standards. And with the rails, the Union Pacific and BSNF, as I stated, they just eliminated the possibility for at-grade crossings for pedestrian or for recreational trails, which it alleviates the safety and liability concerns on the railroad companies, but realistically it inhibits local communities and pedestrians and bicyclists that really need to be able to cross railroads safely.
Okay. All right, and I think that we've got maybe time for one more question. This question is, as a community looking for ways to fund sidewalks and bike paths, what type of programs or funding mechanisms do you see most often in Kansas and generally?
I would say that the cost-sharing programs come up the most often. It's a really good way to share the burden of the cost with property owners. It really incentivizes property owners to help contribute funding to sidewalk repairs. There's also so many different ways to be able to do it that it's really the most prevalent program that I've seen in Kansas communities.
Yeah, and I would say that for communities that are struggling to find ways to pay for sidewalks or rail crossings, that really thinking outside of your local government and looking for partnerships and opportunities through some of those initiatives that Carrie mentioned earlier for railroad crossing, and also looking at state and federal initiatives that may be focused on some of those safety issues with railroads. And also I think that, as Carrie mentioned as well, the whole question about, what railroad responsibility is in this picture is important, because railroads are concerned about safety and liability, and I would think that to the extent you can have a conversation and develop partnerships with railroads and help identify where some safety or liability issues may arise, then that may provide more incentive for the railroad to be involved in finding a solution by working with their community partners, as opposed to not being aware of or not understanding the impact that the rail crossing is having in the community. So I think that that is going to be it for today. And I just want to thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and I want to invite you, if you have any questions, to contact us and let us know if you, I think a few of you have provided us with some suggestions of some complete streets initiatives that you're working on or are aware of. But again, here's our contact information if you want to reach out to us separately about any questions that you have or any suggestions that you have about our work moving forward. We really have appreciated and enjoyed the great partnership and relationships that we have in Kansas, and look forward to working with you moving forward. So I hope you all have a good week, and we'll be in touch soon.